Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 22 in my 50 most relevant 2025. It is the Adelaide Crows skipper, Jordan Dawson. He was a star for us in 2023. With high hopes building for the club and for fantasy coaches, 2024 didn't go to plan for the football club, probably for those that bought into Jordan Dawson. But a new year brings new positive energy and a new opportunity, potentially a little bit of upside. Jordan Dawson is who we are talking about today, and joining me on this podcast for the second time this series of the 50 most relevant, it is the fantasy nut himself. Hello, mate. What an interesting player to talk about in this episode of the 50 most relevant.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks again for inviting me back on. And yeah, Jordan Dawson, he is an interesting one. And I'll tell you now, there is no player priced above 100 that I'm more torn on starting than Jordan Dawson. The upside, the consistency in the right role is absolutely scintillating. Arguably no better fantasy player in the game, at least in terms of the midfield crop, when in that right role. But the other side of things, as we'll get into, perhaps there's no premium with as bad a floor as Jordan Dawson as well.
Yeah, and that's the scary component. Midfield eligible for us this year, a seasonal average of 102.1 in Supercoach. That means he's going to be coming in at a price point of about $550,000. His top score was still pretty solid for us in Supercoach too. 168, just a 5 points off his career high best in Supercoach, which he did in 2023 against the Dockers. It was a 173. While in AFL Fantasy, still a pretty solid average. We're talking about a 105 guy. He will cost you over that $1 million in fantasy and Dream Team. And in that same game that he had his season high score in Supercoach, it's the same in AFL Fantasy Dream Team, a 155. You got to go back to also 2023 for his career high score, a 172 against the Magpies. I was at that game. It was so fun to watch until maybe the last few moments when the Crows lost. But that was peak Jordan Dawson. We've talked about him already, Fantasy Nut, right in these first few moments. He is such an exquisite player. It is rare that a player has the combination of power to win the contested ball. Then when given a chance to deliver the ball by foot with so much skill and poise, overhead to be such a strong and fierce mark, and then to do the dirty stuff and tackle, and then get involved in scoring chains. Just last year alone, 4th for the league for inside 50s per game and 8th in the league per game for meters gained. So this is a player that when the ball is in his hands, Crows players know something good is about to happen. Opposition coaches and opposition players try to minimize his impact on the game because they know when Dawson has the ball, this is the Crows' greatest chance to convert it into scoreboard impact. It's rare to say someone looks, plays, and impacts the game in the vein that a Marcus Bontempelli has done for so long, but the comparisons for Jordan Dawson probably have gone past that now. He is his own man, and he's one of the most damaging players in the AFL right now.
Completely agree. And from a fantasy perspective, just that beautifully well-rounded game where can get a lot of the ball, a high kick to handball ratio, one of the few players that averages both above 5 marks a game, but also can tackle at a high clip as well, averaging over 6 tackles a game since he's moved into the midfield, and absolutely with that peg of his can hit the scoreboard. So it's you combine all these things together, and it's he can hurt you in a number of ways or compile points in a number of ways, which is why his floor is just so high. When he's playing in that midfield role, regardless of how he's going to be able to put it together for that week, you look at the list of fantasy scores over the course of the season, and it's just 100. It's just triple figures up and down the screen. Now, why has he only averaged 105 last year? Because, again, as we'll get into, it's just that when he's shuffled around, that versatility that he does have with his game can also hurt him, which reminds us a little bit of your boy Josh Kelly, perhaps, in the sense of, look, in the right role, yes, they can do anything, but they can play in a number of different positions. And unfortunately, when they are asked to do that on occasion, it results in a poor score. So, look, we know this game of fantasy that we play, it is about value. He is priced at 105. So, folks might question, well, where's the value going to come from? And you just have to look at, I guess, some of his role over the last 2 seasons. That when he gets at least 75% CBAs, and that's 17 games over the past couple of seasons, so it's not that small a sample size. He's averaging 117, and so
Yeah, wow.
and I think it's fair to say if he's able to get anything close to that, he's either going to be the M1 or extremely close to it. So that's really where this upside comes and why he's such an enticing potential starting selection for us this year is if we can work out what this Crows midfield mix is going to be like and the flow on from that is how much time Jordan Dawson's going to spend as a pure inside mid. If it gets up there, we're looking at the number one fantasy score in the game potentially.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Last year we talked about this down season, and yet still the 16 tons in AFL Fantasy, the 9th best midfielder for points last year, 7 scores over 120, and still some of that big ceiling. So 131, a 132, a 155. Concerningly, a couple of sub-80 scores that were real sub-80, like 60s and 50s that we do need to address. While in Supercoach, not as many hundreds as previous seasons or in comparison to AFL Fantasy, but the 102 average, 10 tons, 5 over 120, a 142, 143, a 158, a 168. And so we know and see, as you're alluding to there, when the role is right and alongside that, when the Crows are performing near their potential, this is one of the best fantasy scorers in the game because in 2023, he was that. The 113 average in fantasy, 16 tons, 9 over 120, which is just an incredible conversion rate with that many scores, 100 plus. Well, 17 tons in his 2023 Supercoach season with an average of 115.9 and 8 over 120. But you alluded to this Crows role volatility. Last year, his skill set means he can basically, outside of a ruckman, play every single position on the ground. He came to the Crows as a wingman, halfback, and an interceptor. Then he's developed his game into being a real prominent overhead mark, inside mid, most recently over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. But he was just the everywhere man because the Crows team misfunctioned and misfired in so many areas. Lost some key forward structure with no Riley Thilthorpe for 2/3 of the season. Lost some run and carry through the wings and the halfback with players like Wayne Miller being out of the team. So much didn't go right, but let's now look at the potential positive elements of that for 2025. How do you see this Crows side functioning as a whole? I feel like they've fixed a few issues through the trade period and the free agency period, but what's your take? We will look at the inside midfield in a second, but do you think some of the need for Dawson to play these interchangeable mid-game roles has dissipated, or do you still forecast that is still necessary?
Look, it's an important question and something we've got to work out because that floor is scary and it's up there with the worst in the comp. I put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago where I looked at the midfielders and those that were eligible for the midfield only in fantasy. And I looked at the midfielders that averaged 100 or more last year, and I looked at their worst 3 and 5 game average over the course of the season. And Dawson, if you looked at the worst 3 scores, Dawson had the worst average amongst all the mids that averaged over 100. His worst 3 scores came in an average of about 59, which was worst in the comp. You look at his worst 5 games, his average was 70. Only Lachie Neale was a little bit below that. So once again, when he doesn't have the role we want and when the Crows are asking him to move around to plug holes, his floor is arguably the worst amongst all the premium midfielders. And when we're starting with a starting team where we might only start two or three of these players priced around his point, if they spit out one of those 50 scores, 60 scores to start the season, it's a problem. And so I think that's the thing that we're really grappling with. And coming to your question, I guess when you look back at that 2023 midfield rotation, really it was only it was really only Laird and Dawson. They were in there predominantly the most. And then you had sort of this sprinkling of all sorts of other players. You had Sloan, you had Keys that spent some time in there. You had a little bit of Saligo on occasion, Pedler, Rochelle, Schoenberg. Crouch came in sort of towards the end of the season and probably solidified that third midfielder role. But again, that was towards the end of the year. And then you look at last year, and it kind of seems like that midfield mix was expanded a little bit. It turned out to be that Crouch now was the mainstay in that midfield. Laird was there until the end of the year. And then you had Saligo emerging. Berry spent some time in there, and so did Rankin as well. And I guess this year they're adding in Peatling. You've got Neil Bullen coming in as well into the team. So, I wonder if that then allows someone like a Rankin to move into the midfield a little bit more than perhaps he did even last year. And then as you also alluded to with regards to someone like Tilthorpe, him being fit and healthy and being that big target up forward is probably going to be important for the Crows forward structure, and perhaps they don't need Dawson up there. I mean, there were a couple of games last year when you look at some of these heat maps where Dawson did seem to spend a little bit more time forward of centre. You look at those last, I think it was 5 or 6 games after Tilthorpe returned last year, and Dawson averaged 115 over that time. Now, whether that was a role-related thing going back into the midfield and Tilthorpe helping, or whether that was a match-up thing, I can't necessarily definitely tease that out. I guess you've got Isaac coming back in. I mean, coming into the side as well. So, remains to be seen whether he plays on a half-back or a wing. If he isn't a wing, then you've got him on one wing potentially, and then Scholl on the other wing. Does that mean Dawson, once again, is not required to spend a little bit of time on the outside, which he did appear to do so on occasions last year? So I guess, to your point, some of these Crows recruitments, the fact, hopefully the team's obviously going to be fit. I mean, Cummings not at the moment, and he is injury prone. I guess, does that mean that they don't need Dawson to plug some of these holes, on, whether it be a little bit more up forward, whether it be half back, whether it's a little bit more on the outside on a wing, and does that allow him then to stay a little bit more as an inside midfielder? I certainly hope so. I think even within a game, though, even though he may not enter a game with a view to play sort of a high half forward or anything like that, I certainly think within a game with regards to rotations and those sorts of things, if it's a Cummings turn to come off the field or a Miller's turn to come off the field, is it possible that Dawson is the one that plugs that hole whilst those guys are on the bench? Knowing that he's got that capacity to play all these sorts of different roles, as you said previously, I think that's possible and probable. But it's hard to see him going games on end without being a permanent inside midfielder. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the volatility that we saw for Dawson was because of the dysfunction in other places. And outside of Isaac Cumming, who's basically at time of recording about a week away from back into full training if he's not already there. So you do, and you've mentioned a lot of those names, it feels like those gaps that Dawson plugged can be resolved with Cumming and Miller are now adding some speed and skill on the outside. Okay, all of a sudden, the skill set of why Dawson went to the wing and to the half-back line feel like it's been resolved a little bit. The defensive element of Peatling, bringing him into the ground and into the CBAs means no longer does Dawson have to be the best ball winner and the best defender in the midfield. Peatling is able to add that. And then the structural piece of a Thilthorpe sitting in that space just means no longer is it just two tall forwards, which was Fogarty and then also Walker, and neither are really contested marking beasts. They're much more lead-out style of forwards. They can take contested marks, but that's not their top one skill set, whereas the overhead marking is Thilthorpe's strength and one of Dawson's. So to me, I think the fitness and health of these style of players just opens up now the conversation for the Crows to go, how do we want to build our midfield mix? How much of Crouch, if at all? How much of Dawson, if at all? How do we use a Soligo, if at all? I loved your comparison, or not even a comparison, the reflection that Neil Bullen will free up a player like a Rankin to be a 40, 45, 50% centre bounce midfielder for the Crows. So to me, I think that's the real conversation. Who are the players that they are choosing to build around?
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
I agree. And I guess if we do try and project what that rotation might look like, I mean, Dawson will obviously be in there. Crouch, you'll speak to different people. You'll speak to one set of Crows supporters and they'll say, look, he was, one of, if not, our best midfielder last year. Obviously injured. Now you can quibble over sort of the value that he adds to a team, but nevertheless, it seems like they do like him. So let's assume at this point in time that he's in there. Peatling, I think most agree that he was recruited to be a midfielder. He had multiple clubs chasing him, so it stands to reason he's probably going to choose the club to go to that's going to give him the best opportunity for the position he wants to play. So let's assume he's in there a fair clip as well. You then have got Soligo. Whether they can also fit in a Berry, I doubt it, but it seems to me maybe one of Berry or Crouch might be in the team, but I'm not sure which at this stage. I'd probably lean more towards Crouch. And then you've obviously got Rankin that offers something completely different. So you've got a fair number of folks there that can go through the midfield. But, I mean, we are focusing on the CBAs quite a lot, and understandably so. I quoted, what his statistics are like when he does play almost predominantly in there. But, there are games that he's had 45, 50% CBAs and put up huge scores. I mean, just last year, he had 46% CBAs against Western Bulldogs, put up a 126. He had a game of 50% CBAs against Port, put up a 132, 50% against GWS for a 106, and then a 41% CBA game against West Coast for a 123. So certainly in the right matchup, he's capable as well. This is not necessarily, if he's not a full-time inside mid, that's it. He's going to spit out a 50. Yes, it's perhaps more likely that will happen, but it's not, a fait accompli. I think in the right matchup, he can still do extremely well. But no question that I think if we want him, if we're buying him at a price at 105, we want him ideally to be, going 110 plus. And I think for that to happen, you do need him to be one of those mainstay inside mid.
Yeah, you need him closer to that 65, 70 sort of percent centre bounce rate, and you need some health of one of or both Cumming and Miller and Riley Thilthorpe. I think if you get those things in place, you can have some confidence around Jordan Dawson, whether or not Crouch is in or out, whether or not Berry is in or out. To me, it is if the supporting cast around him have health, he's going to be in and around that midfield enough that he's not having to be projected into emergency gap filler role. And those are the functions that have caused him to not be a fantasy scorer. He averaged 100 in that kind of 10, 12 games that he had at the end of his last year at Sydney on the wing. He averaged 100 for us in that halfback role at the Crows really before he moved into the midfield. The thing that kills his scoring is the role volatility. And the other reason that happens is a lack of health and depth in the Crows. They've recruited depth now. It's all about health. If they have a healthy team come round one, I think you can pursue Dawson with some confidence, knowing that last year, despite so many things going wrong, we're still talking about a 105 average in fantasy and a 102 average in Supercoach. If the Crows have any chance of breaking the finals drought, it's going to have to be on the back of players like Jordan. He is the best player at the club, and if they're going to try and make finals, if Nick's is saving his career, I think Dawson's got to be that central piece. Otherwise, they're no chance.
Well, I mean, I think I completely agree. The question then is, if that's the big variable in terms of Dawson staying in that plum role, do you really want to, I'm not going to go as far as saying bet your fantasy season, but do you really want to bet on the health of Isaac Cumming and Wayne Miller? I guess that would be my counter argument to I think your valid argument is, Dawson himself seems to be, I'm going to jinx him here, but he's not an injury prone player.
No.
But if how he performs is going to be reliant on guys like Cumming and Miller staying on the park, that makes me nervous. Yep. But, I mean, you look at the other guys, I think most folks are contemplating one, maybe two guys priced in that 95 to 105 range, with the popular picks probably being a Nick Dacos, who's coming off a foot injury, Andrew Brayshaw, who's, perhaps the most popular one of this lot, Tom Green, he's got the early bye. Yeah. Tim Taranto, we've got those questions about how bad are Richmond going to be and how well can he really score in a team that's unlikely to produce a high number of fantasy points, and then you've got Rosie, who's perhaps a 105-ish play. Maybe Dacos and maybe a Brayshaw have that 115 plus upside, but of that lot, Dawson's the one that I look at and go, if taking the downside out of it, he's the one that I would have the most confidence in going in that 110, perhaps even 115 range. But once again, if it means for that to happen, Miller and Cumming need to stay on the park, makes me skittish, man.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. That's the beauty of watching what the Crows do in the preseason, because I don't think who's on the inside drastically changes for it. But what I think people that are looking for Dawson, and understandable, there's about 10 points per game of upside that we are forecasting there, if not a fraction more in Supercoach, is we want the club to come out and be adamant around how they're using Dawson, that he's the bull, we're building around him. If the bricks fall down on the outside, we'll use other elements. We're not going to move our best player to fix that issue. We'll use secondary and tertiary pieces to resolve it. If the club come out with anything like that, well, even if a Miller, a Cumming, a Nankervis, a whoever go down and can't play their preferred role due to health, well, then you can still head there. I don't think whether Crouch is in or out of the side is the ultimate definer to how and whether you should go near Jordan Dawson. To me, he's an elite midfielder. He absolutely, if you are spending over $1 million in Supercoach, and over that $550,000 price range in Supercoach, if you're looking for anybody, Jordan needs to sit in there, because outside of others in that spot, injury is not his concern. Early bye is not his concern. There's a lot of Adelaide Oval games early and a couple of pretty favourable fantasy matchups for him using 2024 data. So to me, there's a lot of reasons to love and be interested in Dawson, and there's one or two just slight back of the head headaches that you go, can I live with that? And am I prepared to take an element of risk into my team with someone who's at the upper ends of the price point and offers some value, but not as much as others that are 100,000, 200,000 cheaper, that could, if things go right, match him for a hot early stretch. It's why he's one of the most relevant players, because if everything breaks his way, hello M1, hello Mr. 110 in AFL Fantasy, almost Mr. 120 in Supercoach. That is his potential destiny. And I think the worst case scenario is what he gave us last year. If you can live with the worst case scenario, it probably won't be the pick that costs you your season. So the risk is minimal in terms of he's not going to give you a month and a half worth of 80s and kill your year. It's going to be, do you believe the risk is worth the reward? Because the reward could be pretty tasty, Fantasy Nut.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to your point with regards to it doesn't matter whether Crouch is there or not, I think you're probably right there. Certainly in 2023, there was pretty strong with and without data showing Dawson's average with Crouch in the side versus him without, and it was a big bump without Crouch. Last year, that difference basically disappeared. In the 7 games last year without Crouch, Dawson went at 103, and that average actually bumped up to 106 when Crouch was playing. So I think that's probably a little bit of a red herring. I don't think that plays a big part. With regards to the Crows coming out and saying, look, he's going to be a mainstay in the midfield and we're not moving him. Interestingly, Dawson himself came out a week or two ago. I think it was a news article or something where he basically said, look, he's playing midfield, but he will be moved around when called upon. And it was words to that effect. Now, I guess my interpretation of that was, look, that once again, like kind of when called upon, like when there's a problem or when I need to go somewhere else, or when there's a hole that needs plugging, he's the one that, unfortunately for us fantasy nerds, he's the one that has the capability of doing that. And so I do think that will continue. It's just, how long is it going to be for? How frequently? Does it happen early in the season? Every premium mid has a bad game or two over the course of a season. That's not the issue. The issue, I think, with him is just that flaw and just the idea of you've got 2, maybe 3 of these uber premium players in your starting side, maybe not even. And just the thought of one of them giving you a 50 in the first 2-3 rounds, it just kind of gives you a little bit of pause.
Yeah, and understandably too. Draft, he's one of the most popular names on draft board. You mentioned his durability over a long period of time, that high ceiling that he does give you, meaning you're coming into a final few matchups on a Sunday, you need someone to pop a 150 score. Dawson's definitely got that and more within his scoring wheelhouse. If you're drafting on the keeper platform, which is where the coaches panel chooses to draft in 2025, we will see a little bit of range and variance, as we always do with how people like these top-end mids, because in fantasy, throw an absolute blanket over the top 10, 12 guys. Supercoach, it's a little bit clearer at the top end and then opens up into sort of tier 2 through mids. But in an AFL Fantasy or a keeper platform, where do you think he's going to go on draft day, FantasyNut?
Yeah, I think obviously it's dependent on league settings and these sorts of things, but I'd feel very comfortable drafting him as my M1, whether that's towards the end of the first round, or I think if you can, if you've got sort of a late first round pick and you can jag a Dawson and couple him perhaps with another pretty consistent 100 mid, that's a 100 point per game midfielder. That's a pretty good foundation to build your team off. And I think these floor scores that we've talked a lot about in this podcast, because it's just so relevant for him. Yes, they hurt you in a head-to-head league, but the good news is that whilst we've talked a lot about it, it's not like they're unbelievably common or anything like that, or he has a 6-week stretch where he's playing a different position. It really does seem to be him moving out to plug a hole, as you've said. And quite often, when that happens one week, the very next week he goes bang. So whilst it might hurt you in 1 week in a matchup, there's every chance he comes out the next week and wins the matchup for you. So once again, I'd feel very comfortable drafting him as my M1.
Yeah, I agree totally. An AFL Fantasy Dream Team keeper platform. I think Supercoach, you don't have to reach at the M1. I think he could land to you as an M2. And if you can get a guy that just 12 months ago, we're coming off a 110 average, sitting at that M2 spot, I think you can be really happy and confident to get into that. I think he's going to be one of the best premium midfielders rolling around this year. And as I said, in draft and in classic, if you want to pay up for someone with an early draft pick or spend some big dollars in classic, Dawson's got to be one of those names you strongly consider. Hey, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the 50 Most Relevant yet again. The Coaches Panel listeners love hearing you dissect the game and unpack these conversations with it. I'm sure it won't be the last time we talk to you, either in the preseason or during the 2025 season proper. As always, mate, a pleasure. Where can people get in touch with you across social media if they want to read and hear more from you this preseason?
Yeah, good on you, mate. Thank you again for having me. You can find me on Twitter at FantasyNut_AFL. like to have a bit of a chat on there. So come find me.
Yeah, we'd love that. We put the handle of his X profile in the description of this episode. So if you're like, what was that? Where was that? Don't worry, just go and click the link. We'll take you straight there and you can get all of the takes that he's going to give you right throughout the preseason and season proper. If you've enjoyed this series of the 50 most relevant so far, we're so grateful that you're taking time out of your day every single day to read these great conversations on social media. And again, the details for that are in the description of our episode, or you're just watching and listening. We're so thankful for you doing so. If you are watching this on YouTube, comment below. Let me know, how do you think this Crows midfield is going to shape up? And what do you think Dawson is going to average in 2025? If you haven't subscribed, turn the notifications on and given this video a like. You can do those 3 things within 3 seconds. Guarantee it doesn't take long. And give us a 5-star rating over on whichever audio podcast platform you're listening to. It's one of those small things that you can do that makes a really big difference for us here at the Coaches Panel. In a few seconds, I've got a quick clue for you about who's at number 21. Haven't had too many correct guesses so far throughout this series, so maybe as we get a little bit closer to the top end, maybe today's episode clue will help you pick tomorrow's. Don't forget you can subscribe to our Patreon, get access to a bunch of great stuff. There is a breakout, a premium tier, and a cash cow tier. There is a side that is right for you, and you can also get your hands on some brand new Coaches Panel merch. There is also an extra bonus gift that comes your way when you do get yourself some merch. What it is? Well, those that have got themselves, whether it be one of the hats, the hoodies, the T-shirts, the Coaches Panel preseason notebooks as well, whatever it is you want, we've got you in store. And if you want to know what the preseason special is, you just got to order some merch. Details for that in the description also of this episode. You ready for a clue of who's at number 21? Here we go. He was a guy that 12 months ago, the community was frothing over. We were falling over ourselves to get this guy into our team because structurally, he just felt like an absolute lay down, obvious option. I thought we were reaching as a community. It turned out to be, it was the right approach to not go near said play. I've changed my tune on him from 12 months ago, though, where I thought we were reaching. I feel like now we're talking ourselves out of selecting him at some point in 2025. And I think if you don't consider him at some point as an option this year, not only are you not thinking the best possible outcome here, I think you could be missing one of the best value options this year. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.